Good everyone. I hope you guys have an amazing day. Welcome to another self-hosted transhumanism podcast. My name is Mr. Cohen and I'm the founder of the World Transhumanism Forum. Today I'm going to speak about a topic that is sensitive and also extremely important, a topic that will shape the next century of human civilization. And the topic is designer babies. Before I begin, I wanted to say something very clearly. This podcast is not about arrogance. It's not about playing God. It's not about disrespecting any worldview. I respect people who feel uncomfortable with this idea. I respect people who disagrees with me. But as a transhumanist, I also believe this. If a technology has the potential to reduce suffering, improve the quality of life, and protect future generations, then it becomes our moral responsibility to explore it seriously, carefully, and, of course, ethically. Designer Babies is not just a science fiction. It is a real discussion, real science, real ethics, real consequences. In this episode, I will cover what designer babies actually mean, how it fits within the transhumanist roadmap. Yes, we do have a roadmap, if you heard that right. The strongest argument for and against it, pros and cons, and the guardrails a mature civilization should put in place. All right, let's begin. So, what designer babies actually means. So, when people hear the phrase designer babies, they imagine something extreme, selecting eye color, height, face structure, intelligence, like shopping for traits. That version might exist in the far future, but today we should be precise. Designer babies is not one single thing. It's a spectrum of technologies. Let's start with what already exists. You might have heard about IVF, that's in vitro fertilization. It is a highly effective assisted reproductive technology where eggs are collected from ovaries and fertilized with sperm in a lab. The resulting embryos is then transferred to the uterus to establish a pregnancy. It's usually to treat infertility, including blockages, low sperm quality, or genetic disorder. Um, so many couple uses this technique where and then where multiple embryos are created, then science can screen embryos for severe genetic disorder. This is something we call pre-implantation genetic testing. Now, important point, this is usually not editing, it is a selection, which means choosing the embryo with lower risk. So, in a way, society already accepts a form of genetic optimization, especially when it prevents severe disease. Now, the second point I wanted to raise is about polygenic risk scores. These are emerging technology. So I would also call it as the next stage. Uh, and this involves polygenic risk scoring, which means assessing embryos for statistical risk for complex conditions like heart disease, diabetes, or Alzheimer's. This is controversial, though, I would be very honest, because biology is complex and the risk prediction isn't perfect. So things could go wrong, but it is a part of where science is going. Now, you might have heard about you might have heard about CRISPR, right? So, CRISPR Cas9 and gene editing. Now, there's something called CRISPR germline editing. This is, I would call it as a controversial frontier. This is where debate become intense, editing DNA directly. Now, germline edits can affect future generations, so safety and ethics becomes far more serious. I do understand most countries restrict this strongly today, and the caution is understandable. I acknowledge that because we are still very early. Now, if you wanted to look at beyond CRISPR, right, there is a broader transhumanist tech stack. Now, transhumanism, I'm a transhumanist, right, and I believe transhumanism goes beyond CRISPR. In the future, biology could be redesigning using epigenetic programming, synthetic biology, AI guided genome modeling, and even nanotechnology repair system inside cells. So these are not science fiction, though, right? And I would consider these traits or these tech stack as a part of fifth industrial revolution. So designer babies is not only a debate about one tool. It is a debate about a new era, moving from a random evolution to an intentional evolution. Now, why this matters in transhumanism, if you may ask. So, transhumanism is about increasing human potential, not as a vanity, but as a civilization level upgrade. Human beings are extraordinary, but unfortunately, we are biologically limited. Our biology creates suffering, genetic illness, aging, mental illness, immune disorders, physical decline. So, if transhumanism asks, if you can upgrade software, why not upgrade biology? If you can prevent suffering at the root, why accept unnecessary pain? Designer babies sits in the middle of this philosophy. It's not only treatment of the damage, it's prevention and long-term optimization at the source. Having said, we do need to consider the ethical case for designer babies. Let's explore the strongest ethical arguments in favor of designer babies, not from a hype, but from responsibility. So the first argument I would like to put across is it's about to reduce suffering is should be considered as a moral high ground, which means if we can prevent a child from inheriting severe disease conditions, for instance, that cause lifelong disability, pain, and early death, then the ethical case is strong. Now, you may consider an alternative approach, which is to choosing someone to allow avoidable suffering. In my view, preventing suffering through ethical science is a compassion at a civilization scale. The second point, parents already shape life outcomes. Now, you know, I was raised in a loving family, and and yes, when I was growing up in a Jewish family, my parents kind of emphasized on education, nutrition, values. So if I put this argument from that perspective, or for that matter, any parenting perspective, as a parent, they do make irreversible choices. For instance, the school you go to, food you eat, the value systems you inherit, the religion you follow. Though I would agree that you might change your religious values over the course of time, but you can't change the school you've been to, right? Because that's a part of a history or your past. Now, when you compare that to genetics, genetics feels more permanent. which is why people feel emotionally sensitive when you talk about designer babies. So the ethical debate is not whether parents shape lives. They already do, right? So the debate is how far is reasonable and where do we draw limits? Now, another argument I would like to put across and think about it carefully, right? A civilization should not worship randomness. Nature is not ethical. Nature is random and it's often brutal. Look at the case of dinosaurs, right? What happened to dinosaurs? One day, dinosaurs used to rule the earth. If you think from that perspective, right? From because they were tall, they were giant, they were predators. They hunt small creatures. Um, One fine day, nature decides to wipe them out. So nature is often brutal. It does not care about justice, fairness, or suffering. Did anyone ask the opinion of dinosaurs that, hey, we're gonna take you out? So can we? I mean, nature do not give a horse s about it. Now, civilization is an act of replacing randomness with intelligence. That's what medicine is. That's what science is. So, ethically, it's consistent to explore genetic prevention and improvement carefully and wisely. Now, another argument I would like to put out is with respect to long-term resilience and survival. Look, I'm a Jew, right? History has shown a lot of things, right? Our people have survived Holocaust. Our people have survived all kind of atrocities that thrown at us, but we survived. So the same goes to uh, the viruses, the climate stress, the radiation exposure, and possibility multi-planetary environments. So in future we may face it, right? Look at COVID-19. Unfortunately, it has killed way too many people, which is a terrible thing that has happened to planet. But at the same time, we were able to develop mRNA vaccines, which saved so many lives. So ethically, we should ask, do we have the duty to build future humans that are more resilient? Survival is also an ethical consideration. Now, let's do an ethical case against the designer babies. I mean, let's be honest, right? There are valid ethical arguments against designer babies. Ignoring them would be highly irresponsible. Now, so concern number one, okay, the safety. What about the safety and unintended consequences? Consequences, sorry. Uh, Now, if you look at genetics, right, it's deeply interconnected. A change in one gene can impact multiple systems in a body, right? If you assume human from a system perspective. So if you're considering gene editing or editing DNA, it's not like editing text in a document. Well, more or less, if I simplify, nucleotide in the form of letters, um, but I don't want to get too technical, so I wanted to make this podcast pretty simple so anyone can understand. So a small change could create unintended health problems, right? Usually, when you talk about mutation in a gene, it may be a changing of a letter, a C changing to, A becoming a C nucleotide. So what happens is that it will end up in creating a different kind of protein, or we call it as a phenotype. Uh, so sometimes you might see people born with 6 fingers. So that could be as a result of a gene mutation that carry forward from parent to child, or during the cell division. Or if I put in a simple terms, right, a change in a gene can impact um, your human health. So with germline edits, mistake can spread into future generations from parent to child, child to grandchild. So ethics requires extreme caution, research integrity, and strong safety thresholds. These are the things we should be considering. Now, another concern, what about the consent and autonomy? A child cannot consent to irreversible biological change. A germline edit can affect descendants too. Parents already make many decisions, right? Look, I was born into a Jewish family. Not that I asked for. I mean, I'm not complaining. My parents were not very religious, right? They were more into cultural aspect of Judaism. Um, we do celebrate holidays, do Shabbat, and sorry I digress, but I'm just trying to give you a context. So what I'm trying to say, I didn't ask for that, right? I didn't ask any of it, right? My parents decided that as a kid I should be observing all of this thing. The same goes for other faith or non-faith or and other aspect, right? Like I mentioned before, the school you go to, the stuff you eat and the language you speak and kind of stuff. So so that shapes your identity, right, as you grow up. In a similar way, genetics could shape your identity, right? Like a person, skin color, tone, it's a pigmentation gene, right? You can alter it. Maybe your skin color might look different. Um, so, or like I said, the concept of 6 fingers, you could have 7 fingers. Um, I'm just giving you and you could create a protein which is responsible for something else, which your body, which you were deprived of from birth, or other phenotypes, right? So that's why a mature society must set limits and require exceptionally strong justification, especially for enhancement. I support designer babies, but at the same time, I do agree we need to have an ethical framework in place where we should be following those ethical guidelines before we enhance a human entity. Now, I'm not saying from a religious perspective, I don't honestly care because religion is not science. That's a person's worldview, like I said. Everyone has a different worldview. I have my own worldview, but one worldview should not enable other worldview to do the things the first worldview needs. What I meant was that if you don't want to be part of something, sure, you can stay out of it, but that does not mean you should put a pressure on other people with a different worldview to not to be part of it. Now, I agree the concern is real, right? So now there's another classic concern is inequality and a genetic class system. You know how fractured our society is. We got racism all over the people. I as a Jew, I know what our people have gone through. The things have improved, but yet um, it's better in some part of the world. It's not better in other part of the world. The same goes to different group of people, right? If enhancement becomes available only to wealthy families, we could create a biological class system. And the concern is real. The solution is not banning progress, right? I mean, if you ask my opinion, it's ethical governance and access policy that prevent a permanent genetic divide. You could also argue about social pressure because even if the enhancement is optional, society might pressure parents into doing it out of fear of their child will be left behind. Now, ethics requires freedom of choice. No pressure, no forced standardization, no discrimination. Now, I would also like to raise another concern. That's what about historical trauma and eugenics fear? Now, you talk about eugenics, what Nazis used to do, right? That's a negative eugenics. You know, it's a racial supremacy. That's not what we're talking about. I'm talking about the positive side, positive eugenics, where you would be able to get rid of your genetic disorders using designer babies. Now, I understand that humanity has abused the science before. Like I gave an example of Nazi Germany, is what they did to Jewish people and to other peoples as well. So fear about eugenics is not paranoia. It's a warning. I 100% acknowledge that. That's one of the reasons why we do need human rights-based governance, transparency, independent oversight, and strict ban on state-driven genetic control. Now, that's kind of a ethical argument, right? if you so from a pro and a con perspective. Now let's look at forget about an argument from an ethics perspective. Now let's look at the pros and cons. Keeping ethics out of equation. Um, because I just wanted to discuss the pros and cons clear breakdown. Right? Let's look at the pros, right? Now, obviously, concept of designer babies or gene editing will eliminate severe genetic disease, potentially ending certain disorders forever, improved human resilience, and you can say the future humans will be better protected against cancers and pandemic. Um, Also, there is a possibility of long-term cognitive optimization. I understand it's a controversial topic, but could influence civilization quality and levels of thinking and other stuff. Now, let's talk about the cons as well, right? Like I said, this is not an ethical pros and cons. It's just from a generic pros and cons perspective. So you could have an unpredictable biological risk and long-term unknown consequences, because where do we stop? Where do we draw the line? If you keep on going, then we might have unknown consequences. Now, there will be a risk of misuse by authoritarian state or extremist ideologists. That could be a potential risk. Imagine uh, a bad actors getting access to a designer baby technology. They could misuse it, right? So that's a concern. That's a serious concern. So that's why we need to have a guardrails in place to prevent those. Now, I wanted to ask this final question. Where do we draw the line, right? We heard about ethics, we talked about pros and cons and all the good things, right? Now, where do we draw the line? So, where is the ethical line, right? I mean, let's put that way. So, I consider what I believe, right? We should be talking about three stages, right? When we talk about ethical line, first stage is about disease prevention. So it's one of the easiest and strongest ethical point to justify. Um, and the second stage we should be considering is the risk reduction. I mean, it's reasonable, right, when supported by robust evidence and transparency. And the third stage, which I would say is the final stage, which is should be an optional and which should be highly regulated and which should be governed by strict rights and access framework that's enhancing humans. You may not agree about enhancement. Like I, as a transhumanist, if I had an opportunity, I would enhance myself. I wanted to program my cognitive skills. I would like to program the way my, my biology holds. So there are a lot of things I could do if I have a choice. Now, in saying, I would also say any responsible framework relating to disease, risk enhancement should include safety first, informed consent, voluntary choice, independent oversight, um, human-driven framework, and policies for equitable access over time. If you could have this in place before we even start talking about or before we start implementing the concept, then I believe we would be in a better space. Now, before I end this podcast, right, I just wanted to say a few things. First of all, thank you for listening. And I know it's a controversial topic and you may not agree with it. Some people say, hey, this guy's talking shit. We don't agree with that. I respect that. That's one of the things I mentioned before I start this podcast, that I respect different worldview. But my worldview is this, right? I do support the designer babies. I do support it, the concept of it, because for me, designer babies is not merely a technology debate, it's a maturity test for civilization. We can either fear progress and push it to into the underground black markets, or we can build ethical guardrails and guide science responsibly. I would love to see ethical guardrails in place rather than someone doing designer baby experimentation underground, right? That is dangerous. That's not good for our civilization. That can cause lots of bad things in the society. As a transhumanist, I choose maturity, not rushing. I don't want to rush into it, right? I'm not denying the the cons associated with the designer babies, but I believe in moving forward with wisdom. In saying thank you again for listening to this podcast. If you found this episode valuable, please share it. If you disagree, I do welcome respectful conversation. Until next time, stay curious, stay rational, and keep evolving.